Welcome to the History of the Ancient Near East. I'm Justin Singleton. In this lecture, we'll be discussing the Neo-Babylonian Empire. And as I have dogs running around under my feet, behind me, whining every once in a while, forgive me for all the extra noises. Now, specifically in this lecture, we're going to talk about the resurgence of Babylon, the kings Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, and then finally the fall of Babylon. Although the empire was short-lived, spanning merely 87 years from around 626 to 539 BC, the Neo-Babylonian Empire changed the geopolitical and cultural landscapes of the Near East. The empire itself was born out of revolution, specifically the Chaldean revolt against Assyria. And it managed to gain control not only of Lower Mesopotamia, but Upper Mesopotamia as well, along with parts of modern-day Iran, Syria, the Levant, even down into Saudi Arabia, including the capture of Jerusalem as recorded in the scriptures. Babylonia at the beginning of the first millennium was economically poor and politically unstable. The power of the rightful kings of Babylon was being destabilized by multiple Semitic tribes moving into the area. And under Shamshi-Adad V, Babylon became so weak that the Assyrians were able to take a key stronghold and imprison the Babylonian king, all to the benefit of the migrating tribes, who already controlled much of the rural hinterland, and therefore the agricultural economy. Southern Babylonia at this time consisted mainly of marshes and lagoons. And the tribes who controlled the southern alluvium, these semi-autonomous Chaldean tribes, became more and more powerful. Unrest at the hands of these tribes brought the military might of Assyria back to the area over and over again to quell resurgent rebellions. The Assyrians attempting not to destroy or dismantle their southern neighbors, but rather to end the tribal assaults on a weakened Babylon. Remember, these Chaldeans, they were not Babylonians. They were trying to take over the Babylonians. Now, having a rather strong tendency toward urban life, the Chaldeans competed for the Babylonian throne, likely rotating power amongst the three major Chaldean tribes. And the native Babylonians resented the foreign rule, taking the throne back whenever the chance arose. At the time that Tiglath-Pileser III took power in Assyria around 745 BC, a native Babylonian king sat on the throne of Babylon. But when that king died, a power struggle ensued. And ultimately, the Chaldean Nabu-Mukhenzar seized the throne. Tiglath-Pileser III marched on the south, but it took him 3 years to defeat the well-entrenched Chaldeans, who ultimately fled to the unconquerable swamps of the south. Now, these attacks against the Babylonian region were not anti-Babylonian, particularly as Assyria supported native Babylonians holding the throne, as a stable and subservient south only enriched the north. In fact, native Babylonians supported the Assyrian attack upon the city in 710 BC. Sargon moved to expel the Chaldeans, who were under the tribal leadership of Merodach-Baladan, these native Babylonians welcoming Assyria. These types of battles recurrently transpired over about a century, and the rather constant intrusion on part of the Assyrians had a reverse effect than they had hoped for, namely the uniting of the Chaldean tribes. Now, of interest, it was during these resistance years that Marduk-apla-iddina II sent a letter to Hezekiah, king of Judah in the southern Levant, as recorded in 2 Kings 20, 12 through 19, under the name Merodach-Baladan. Hezekiah then, likely in an attempt to recruit Babylon as allies against a Syrian threat, shows off the riches of Judah. In the year of Nabopolassar's ascension, the first king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a prolonged war was occurring in Assyria. The Medes and Scythians threatened Assyrian dominance in the east. And while the Assyrians were fighting the Elamites, Cimmerians in the west, that's the people of Conan the Barbarian, attempted an attack that, although ending in failure, allowed for destabilization of the West that led to the independence of several Western states. Nabopolassar began to consolidate power in the region of Babylonia, including the making of a matrimonial alliance with the Medes, finding a wife for Nebuchadnezzar, and even forming an alliance with Josiah, king of Judah. Nabopolassar would proclaim himself as an avenger of Babylon who swore to punish the Assyrians for their arrogance and past sacrilege. Now, in Nabopolassar's 10th year, the king, strategically planning for a future war with Assyria, campaigned up the Euphrates into the region of Suhu and Hindanu in order to control major roads leading to Anatolia and the iron trade centers found there. Only a few months later, the Babylonian armies marched east of the Tigris, where they were victorious in Arafah, opening the heartland of Assyria to attack. By 615 BC, Nabopolassar laid siege to Ashur itself. Along with his Median allies, Nabopolassar defeated the Assyrians in 612 BC and ushered in the Neo-Babylonian Empire, also called the 10th dynasty of Babylon, or the Chaldean Empire, pushing the region of Babylon into an era of economic and political stabilization. Around 40 years after the foundation of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the transition was made from aggression to consolidation. The new Babylonian kings partially consolidated power by forcing temples and cities that had previously been granted tax and labor exemptions to relinquish a great deal of their autonomy. The new empire increased its investments and paid much more attention to the empire's periphery than before, and the flow of resources from the periphery to the core of the empire brought new construction projects to Babylon and its close surroundings, surpassing the Assyrians as builders. Now, of note, toward the end of his reign, Nabopolassar moved to crush Assyria, which by this time had retreated to Carchemish in the Levant, after the temporary capital at Haran had fallen. King Necho II of Egypt marched toward Carchemish to help reinforce his Assyrian allies, but he was delayed when Josiah, king of Judah, attempted to stop Egypt at Megiddo, as noted in 2 Kings 23. Now, Josiah met Egypt in battle, but upon his death in that same battle, Judah fell under Egypt's authority, who now promised to support Judah against the Babylonians. Unfortunately for Egypt, the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC was a decisive victory for Babylonia, whose armies were at the time led by Nebuchadnezzar II, the crown prince of Babylon. Egypt now retreating back to her own lands, Nebuchadnezzar campaigned throughout the Levant in order to gain control of the region, and Jehoiakim, who had been placed on the Judean throne by Necho II of Egypt, changed allegiance and bowed before Babylon, but not before Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem and carried off many of its inhabitants, and the very treasures that were egotistically displayed to the Babylonians under Hezekiah, as seen in 2 Kings 20. In 601 BC, only a few years after the death of Nabopolassar, Judah openly defied and challenged the Babylonian Empire, resulting in a military response by the new king, Nebuchadnezzar II, as noted in the biblical text. Unfortunately for Judah, Nebuchadnezzar II was a rather successful general who recaptured Jerusalem in 597 BC carrying off even more of its inhabitants. 10 years later, Judah rebelled again, but this time Babylon would destroy Jerusalem and the temple, exiling the ruling class. The greatness that was the Neo-Babylonian Empire really only lasted during the reigns of the first two kings, Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar II. Marduk, also called Evil-Merodach in 2 Kings 25, came to the throne after his father Nebuchadnezzar, but his reign lasted only about 2 years before his assassination at the hands of Nergal-Sharezer, commonly known as Neriglissar in Aramean. The latter reigning only about 3 years before his death and succeeded by his son La-Bashi-Marduk for only a few months before another coup brought power to yet another dignitary, Nabonidus. Nabonidus, along with Nabopolassar and Nebuchadnezzar, was both a conqueror and a builder, surpassing even the Assyrians. One aspect of the changing administration during the Neo-Babylonian Empire involved state-sponsored religion, particularly as Nebuchadnezzar and Nabonidus increased royal control over the temples, which included royal appointees to new religious offices. Although Nabonidus completed several civil building projects, such as the rebuilding of a hydraulic system near Sippor, it is perhaps his cultic building projects that received the most attention, such as the construction work on the temple Ebabar at Sippor, or the creation of a new tiara for the god Shamash. Other projects include rebuilding or restoring temples and ziggurats such as the temple of Lugal-Marada at Marad and the ziggurat of Ur. Religion appears to have been important to Nabonidus. Before marching toward Arabia, the king visited several southern cities where he helped with the administration of the Iana temple. But it would appear that his greatest desire was to restore the Ehulul, the temple of the god Sin at Haran. It's probable that the king's interest in rebuilding the Ehulul stems from his mother, who likely originated from Haran, and who held a priestly office there. She was devoted to the god Sin of Ehulu, as noted in the Atagupi stela, a stela dedicated to Atagupi, Nabonidus' mother. In fact, I kind of messed up there. Thus, this woman of the north, in her dedicatory stela, notes that she and her son promised to repay Sin for their successes, that's the god Sin, for their successes by rebuilding the temple there. In fact, Nabonidus called up workers from all over the empire, including the borders of Egypt and the land of Hatti, for the reconstruction purpose. The reconstruction being complete only by the time of Nabonidus' return from his Arabian campaign. Nabonidus attempted to rewrite history in removing blame from Nabopolassar for the destruction of Haran and Ehulu, and shifted that blame onto the Medes, likely an attempt to convince Babylonians to support his endeavor. Unfortunately, the decision to rebuild the temple at Haran drew sharp criticism and even plots of treason, to which Nabonidus responded by beginning a 10-year western campaign that brought him to Arabia. Basically, he ran away. The Arabian campaign of the king led his armies as far south as Medina in modern-day Saudi Arabia. Nabonidus, having left Babylonia for Arabia in his 4th year, and returning only in his 13th year. The king went to Arabia as a conqueror, defeating or killing city leaders at differing sites, and then establishing himself a palace at the oasis of Tema. Now, it's uncertain why Nabonidus went to Arabia, but his elevation of Sin above Marduk in the city of Babylon, which had been the center of Marduk worship since 600 years before, along with his neglect of other Babylonian traditional deities, may have created a need to escape oppression or further assassination attempts. In fact, when Nabonidus finally returned to Babylon, Babylonia witnessed a replacement of the highest officials in the empire. Now, another theory for the king's long stay in Arabia includes the worship of the moon god there, but the evidence is incomplete. While Nabonidus was in Arabia, a new power began to rise in the general region: the Persians. Cyrus of the Persians overthrew the Median king and conquered the Median capital of Ecbatana, beginning the first stages of the Persian Empire. This growing threat may have been the reason for the king's return, to take back control that he had left to his son, Belshazzar, biblical Belshazzar, in order to prepare for war. Ultimately, Babylon did fall. Nabonidus had left his son as regent over the empire, but Belshazzar had never taken an official title, and certain responsibilities of the king went unperformed. For example, during the king's self-imposed exile, the Babylonian New Year's ritual had been suspended. But upon the king's return, the Akitu festival, the Babylonian New Year's festival that usually included obeisance to Marduk and the ritual humiliation of the king, may have been replaced with a similar festival from Haran dedicated to the god Sin. Interestingly, the day of the festival celebration was the day after Babylon was taken by Cyrus, meaning that the feast in Daniel 5 was an evening of celebration before the Akitu festival celebrating Sin. Now, of particular interest, Cyrus, after defeating the Babylonian army, is said to have been welcomed into Babylon by Marduk himself, as Nabonidus simply surrendered. Now, according to Persian propaganda, the fall of the empire was the result of the sins of Nabonidus. Although propaganda, the king's disdain for Marduk and hatred from the Babylonians may indicate that the propaganda was at least partially true. Now, I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and hope you forgive me for the whining dogs in the background. As always, feel free to reach out to me if you need anything.